My name is Captain Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, and today I speak not only for the 22 million souls in my nation, but for a continent whose stories have been twisted, whose pain has been ignored, and whose dignity has been repeatedly auctioned off at the altar of foreign interests. Africa is not Tobago.
A new voice is shaking Africa's old chains, and it's coming straight from the dusty heart of Burkina Faso. When President Ibrahim Traoré stood before a crowded hall in Ouagadougou, there was no polished teleprompter, no carefully rehearsed lines. Just a man, a microphone, and a conviction that had been building for generations. What he unleashed in that moment didn't just echo through his own country. It cracked across borders, settling into the hearts of millions who've grown tired of being treated like someone else's property. It all began days earlier, when reports swirled across social media that Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had warned African leaders to stay in line or face consequences. Whether he truly uttered those words hardly mattered. The message that Africa still needed to be kept under someone's thumb landed like salt in an open wound. And for Traoré, that was enough. Standing under bright lights, flanked by Burkina Faso's green, red, and yellow flags, Traoré didn't bother with diplomatic niceties. "We are done staying silent," he declared, his voice cutting through the heavy air like a blade. "We are done bowing down. We are done letting foreign powers treat our continent like their playground." It was a speech that scorched. Reporters shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Military officers along the walls tightened their grips on ceremonial swords. And across Africa, people leaned closer to their screens, hardly believing what they were hearing. Because here was a head of state, not a rebel or a university activist, telling the world that Africa would no longer be bullied. And he wasn't reading from a carefully drafted statement. Traoré spoke without notes, eyes locked on the cameras as though Netanyahu himself might be watching live. "Let me make this crystal clear to you, Mr. Netanyahu," Traoré continued, leaning forward so that every word seemed to leap from the lens. "Burkina Faso does not answer to Tel Aviv. We don't answer to Washington. We don't answer to any force that thinks it can buy us or bomb us into doing what they want." For a moment, the entire room went dead quiet. No coughs, no shuffling papers, just the hum of the lights and the weight of Traoré's words hanging in the silence. But he didn't stop there. This wasn't just about Israel. It was about every powerful nation that had ever treated Africa like a field to be plowed for profit. Its gold, its oil, even its people. He made a promise that carried the gravity of history behind it. "If you come for one of us, you come for all of us. Africa is not yours to threaten." In the hours that followed, something remarkable began to unfold. Clips of his speech, rough and unedited, started bouncing around WhatsApp groups in Lagos, Dakar, and Johannesburg. On X, the old Twitter, short excerpts of his defiance sparked tens of thousands of retweets. Telegram channels that usually focused on celebrity gossip or football matches found themselves flooded with hashtags like #Africa will not bow and #We stand with Traoré. Young people in Mali posted reaction videos, some wiping away tears. Farmers in Niger sent voice notes in local dialects pledging solidarity. Student groups in Guinea organized small rallies, hoisting hand-painted signs that read simply, "We are not colonies." Even leaders weren't immune. Colonel Assimi Goïta of Mali shared Traoré's speech with a blunt caption, "He speaks for all of us." Guinea's Mamadi Doumbouya echoed the sentiment days later, saying his country would stand shoulder to shoulder with Burkina Faso. For many, this wasn't just another fiery speech destined to fizzle out. It felt like a turning point, a moment when Africa's patience with lectures and threats had finally expired. Because while the outside world often measures African sovereignty by neat lines on a map, for people on the ground, it's always been something deeper, a question of who gets to decide. Who gets to say how the gold is mined, where the oil is sold, what languages children learn in school? Who gets to write the rules? Traoré made it painfully clear that in his Burkina Faso, those days of quiet obedience were over. And it wasn't lost on anyone that he wasn't just speaking as the leader of a small West African nation. In that instant, he became a vessel for the frustrations of an entire continent. Still, skeptics wondered how far this new defiance could go. After all, How many times had Africa heard leaders promise to shake off foreign control, only to see them cozy back up to old powers when money or military aid came knocking? But as part 2 of this story will show, what followed next suggests something far more serious and far more lasting. The day after Traoré's speech, streets in Ouagadougou were buzzing with a cautious sort of pride. Vendors selling roasted maize and second-hand jeans paused their banter to replay clips of their president on cracked phone screens. Old men nodded, muttering that they hadn't heard words like that since the Pan-African movements of the 1960s. But it wasn't just Burkina Faso that was stirred. Across the Sahel, countries bound by shared history and fresh wounds from exploitation began to signal something bigger was underway. Mali's Goita didn't waste time. He posted a short video standing beside his defense chief, stating bluntly, "Any threat to Burkina Faso is a threat to Mali." Niger's leadership echoed that by sending an official letter of solidarity to Ouagadougou, praising Traoré's courage. Within days, what had started as a fiery declaration turned into a solidifying pact, one they called the Sahel Alliance. At its heart, the Sahel Alliance wasn't just a military arrangement. It was a loud rejection of the long game that foreign powers had played on African soil for decades. Traoré said it best when he appeared again on national TV, speaking without pomp or flourish. "For too long, we've let others draw our maps, manage our treasuries, even decide who our friends should be. That's over. This is our continent, our land, and from here on, our rules." These weren't just symbolic words. Within weeks, Burkina Faso's government began reviewing mining contracts that for years had siphoned gold and manganese profits straight into foreign bank accounts. Traoré ordered audits of companies that paid workers less than a living wage, while shipping raw resources abroad to be refined in Europe and Asia. He threatened to revoke licenses if standards weren't met, a move that rattled several multinational firms. It was a risky strategy, but many in Burkina Faso felt the risk of doing nothing was far greater. For decades, glittering promises of development had left little behind but dusty roads, hollowed-out towns, and youth desperate enough to migrate or pick up arms. Meanwhile, in markets and cafes, ordinary Burkinabé debated what all this would mean. Some feared sanctions. They spoke in hushed voices of the fate of leaders like Libya's Gaddafi, who had also dared to challenge global financial systems and paid with his life. Others believed Traoré might finally break the pattern, not because he was stronger, but because he wasn't standing alone. The Sahel Alliance was already drawing up mutual defense plans. Troops from Mali and Niger were spotted training together just outside Koudougou. The message was unmistakable. An attack on one would trigger a response from all. Yet sovereignty wasn't only about soldiers with rifles. It was about shaking off the quiet invasions too. The subtle forms of control buried in banking systems, aid packages, and advisory boards. Traoré's administration announced plans to move state reserves away from old colonial ties, choosing regional banks instead of French-controlled financial centers. It was small in scale, but psychologically massive. The Western press mostly ignored these moves or framed them as reckless. A few outlets ran stories warning that Burkina Faso was isolating itself, jeopardizing foreign investment. But on the ground, many saw something very different. A people waking up, choosing uncertainty on their own terms over comfort with a collar around their neck. There were still deep anxieties. Parents worried what would happen if France or the US decided to punish Burkina Faso with sanctions. Traders wondered if markets would dry up. But even those concerns often ended the same way, with a shrug and a resigned, almost stubborn pride. As one shopkeeper told a local radio station, "Let them close their doors. At least we'll starve as free people, not beggars." Meanwhile, in unexpected corners of Africa, Traoré's stand was igniting conversations that had long been whispered but rarely spoken aloud. University students in Ghana held panel discussions on what true independence might finally look like. In Kenya, youth leaders tweeted manifestos urging their government to learn from Burkina Faso and start building real self-reliance. Everywhere, small acts of solidarity cropped up. Senegalese musicians dropped freestyles praising the Sahel Alliance. In Tanzania, artists painted murals of a united Africa. No borders, just a single rising sun behind familiar outlines of the continent. The sentiment was clear. Africa was imagining itself again, not through the gaze of Paris, London, or Washington, but through its own hopeful, sometimes defiant eyes. Back in Burkina Faso, Traoré didn't slow down. In a televised town hall, he laid out simple truths that cut through years of polished lies. Sovereignty is not a luxury, it's a responsibility. It's the right to decide who digs in our soil, who teaches our children, who builds our roads. If we cannot control these things, then we are still living under a flag that is not our own. By then, even skeptics had to admit something real was happening. This wasn't just political theater for short-term applause. It was a profound shift, a gamble that collective dignity was worth more than foreign grants and polite applause at international summits. In Part 3, we'll explore how these moves ripple beyond Burkina Faso, how silence from powers like Israel, the nervous recalculations in France and the US, and the spreading fire of Pan-African unity might reshape the continent's next chapter. As Traoré's bold stand took shape in concrete policies and military drills, reactions outside Africa began to show. The Israeli government, so directly named in Traoré's speech, remained eerily quiet. No rebuttal, no clarifying press release. It was as if they hoped ignoring him would make it all fade. But silence can be more telling than any statement. Analysts and European think tanks started publishing cautious briefs about unexpected resistance in West Africa. In Paris, officials privately grumbled that these new alliances could derail France's long-standing economic interests. In Washington, staffers on African desks revised strategy memos, grappling with the realization that a corner of Africa once treated like a pawn was now openly rejecting the entire board. Some foreign commentators insisted it was reckless. They pointed to Burkina Faso's modest GDP, its heavy reliance on imports, its fragile institutions. They warned of collapse, of isolation, of opening doors to rival powers that might swoop in to exploit vulnerabilities even more ruthlessly. But on the streets of Ouagadougou, Bamako, Niamey, those arguments fell flat. People knew the risks. They also knew the costs of doing nothing, staying in a rigged game where someone else always ended up holding the wealth while local hospitals ran out of basic medicine. That's why, despite the international hand-wringing, everyday Africans felt a charge of cautious hope. For once, leaders weren't just using nationalism as a campaign slogan. They were staking their governments, maybe even their lives, on the promise of true self-determination. It wasn't all flags and cheers. Traoré's hard line meant difficult days ahead. Some foreign companies threatened to pull out. Aid organizations bristled at new oversight rules. Prices on imported goods ticked upward, testing the patience of citizens who still needed to feed their families tonight, not just bask in the promise of future sovereignty. Yet even with these pressures, something profound was taking root. Across radio talk shows and market stalls, people weren't only talking about hardships, they were talking about opportunity, about finally building industries that processed Africa's minerals at home, about regional banks that wouldn't drain profits to Zurich or Paris, about teaching children African history before European history, so they would know who they were long before anyone else tried to define them. And the idea was catching fire beyond the Sahel. In Accra, young entrepreneurs proposed West African tech incubators that could fund each other instead of chasing venture capital from Silicon Valley. In Lusaka, farmers' unions discussed regional seed banks to avoid dependency on global agro giants. In Abuja, even members of parliament debated aligning more closely with a new African bloc, instead of old bilateral ties that always seemed to tilt one way. None of this meant a united continent was around the corner. Old rivalries, linguistic splits, and deep scars from past wars wouldn't vanish overnight. But for the first time in decades, many Africans sensed the continent was pulling in the same general direction. Not because a foreign power demanded it, but because people wanted it. Meanwhile, Traoré seemed almost uninterested in global approval. In a sit-down with local journalists, he shrugged off international criticism. They tell us to be patient, to keep trusting the systems that failed our parents and grandparents. I tell them, we've been patient long enough. His calm was startling. It didn't come from naivety. It came from a conviction that sometimes dignity matters more than stability bought at the price of someone else's favor. Outside Africa, many still underestimated what was brewing. Western newspapers covered it in back pages, often with the same tired frames of instability or populist risk. They missed the real story, that millions of Africans were watching each other rise, daring to believe that their continent could finally chart its own path. Traoré's face became a meme not of mockery, but of encouragement. Young Africans across the diaspora, from student dorms in London to barbershops in New York, began sharing clips of his speeches with simple captions like, "About time," or "This is what leadership looks like." And in all of it, the biggest shift wasn't happening in presidential palaces or high-level summits. It was happening in the minds of ordinary people who suddenly remembered that the future wasn't set in stone, that they could demand something better. As one Burkina Faso mother told a reporter after standing in line for hours to buy pricier imported flour, "It's hard now, yes, but it was hard before too, just quieter. Maybe my children will grow up free of begging, and that's worth every bit of this." In many ways, that summed up the entire moment. This wasn't a neat revolution with clear victories or defeats. It was messy, uncertain, sometimes frightening, but it was also alive and led by Africans for Africans in a way that hadn't been seen for generations. So, what do you think? Is Africa on the verge of a genuine rebirth, or is this another cycle that global pressures will eventually crush? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from and what you believe lies ahead for the continent. If you found this story worth sharing, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It's the best way to support more reporting that puts Africa's voice first.